Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter, Nidia, Wada, for being here today. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and thank you, Evelyn, as well, for organizing this. So today we will discuss a little bit a general overview of the Web2Cit core library architecture. And the reason why we're doing this today is because a part of the project, of the Web2Cit project, is to provide some technical documentation, and I wanted to provide technical documentation regarding the architecture of this central, very important part of the Web2Cit ecosystem. And even though, as also mentioned by Peter before, sometimes having written documentation is better because it might be easier to update. It is also the case that it takes lots of time, and right now the priority of the project is to continue developing the translation editor. So it was a choice between having nothing or having at least this overview video, and we thought that it would be important as a resource that people that would be interested in contributing to the project could maybe watch to have a general overview of how the code is structured. And then, of course, if they need further detail, they would have to go to the code or hopefully in the future to a written documentation. So please feel free to interrupt me. The reason why we wanted to have, rather than just me talking to the air, having more of a conversation, was that maybe some things are not well understood, or maybe you have questions or comments. So please feel free to interrupt me. And I'm not very good at monitoring the chat. So if Scan, you see that somebody has asked some, and if you're available there, I'd appreciate it if you could let me know. But anyway, I will try to monitor it myself. And okay, let me just watch. Okay, here. And well, these are some important links. So the first one is where the core library code lives in the Wikimedia, the Wikimedia's GitLab instance. The Fabricator, where we are tracking tasks, is down there as well. Here, Web2Cit core in Fabricator. And the resources that we will be watching today are available in this shared library in Google Drive. Okay, so to the next slide. Before we get started, I wanted to give a general overview of how Web2Cit works. We have uploaded a video like this to this link here. I think it was the week before, but because many of you may not have seen it, I'm gonna very briefly go through how Web2Cit works, because this is gonna be very helpful to understand what I will explain later. So let's imagine this gray box here is Web2Cit. Oh, sorry, here. Let's imagine this gray box here is Web2Cit. So Web2Cit is organized into, the way how translation is configured is organized into domains. So this blue box here is the configuration for domain example.com, and this other blue box here would be the configuration for domain sub.example.com. And the way, when I mean configuration, I mean translation templates. So within this example.com domain, we have, for example, 3 translation templates. One for example.com/blog/article1. This is like the template web page path. These other 2 templates, and we have, for example, in this example, a translation template for this other example.com domain. So if we give Web2Cit a target web page that we would like to translate, and again, just in case, when I say translate, I mean extract relevant citation metadata for this target web page. So when I give this target web page to Web2Cit, some things happen here, which I'm going to explain in a minute, and we get a citation as an output, which is a structured object with citation fields and their corresponding, like, well, what is the item type, what is the title, the author names, and so on. So when I mean translation template, I mean a series of fields. That is, for example, in this case, we have 2 fields, the item type field and the author last field. These fields might, here it should say required. Okay, these fields might or might not be required. I'm going to explain what this means. And within each field, we can have one more translation procedures. And these translation procedures define some rules, define some instructions to get metadata out of a target web page. So if we have a target web page, we feed this target web page to the template, to each of these fields and to each of the procedures within each field, and we get a template output. And this template output is a series of field outputs. So we have an output for the item type field, an output for the author last field. These outputs come from having applied this procedure, for example, to the target web page for the item type field, or these two procedures for the author last field. And these field outputs can have one or more values. Yeah, so in this example, we have just one value, it's the output of this procedure. And in this case, we have three values, which is the combined output of these two procedures for the author last field. And these outputs can either be valid or invalid for a specific field. So say, for example, for item type, we have a series of rules that tell us, yes, whether a specific output is a valid output for the field or not. So for each field output, we can say if the output is valid or if the output is invalid. And as long as a valid output for all fields that have been set as required in the template, then we can say that the template is applicable for the specific target web page that we gave it. And in that case only, we get a citation for that template. So, and again, if for all required fields of a template, the output is a valid output, then the template is applicable for the target web page, and we get a citation from the template. Otherwise, we would not get a citation from that template. I'm going a little fast. Again, if you want to know the details, you can check the overview video that we uploaded. This is anyway what we're doing right now is also going to be recorded and uploaded. And anyway, when we get to the architecture part, some of these things might be clearer. So even further, like getting into this even further, let's see what a translation procedure looks like. A translation procedure is a series. Oh, sorry. Here it should. I'm missing some text here. I'm sorry. For some reason, it's not showing. So a procedure is a series of selection steps, which are these here to the left, and a series of.
Diego, you can try if you press F5, maybe to like updating or going out from the presentation might work.
I'm using. Sorry, just a second. Let me share my screen again. I'm sorry. You can see my screen again, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, for some reason it's not showing, doesn't matter. This is not so important. I have a procedure which is represented by this arrow here, and a procedure includes a series of selection steps, which are these to the left here, and a series of transformation steps, which are these to the right here. Let me close the presentation and see it here, because I want to see those. You see my screen again here, right? Cool. So we have these selection steps and this transformation. So if we give a target web page to the procedure, and when we say a target web page, we are actually meaning multiple things in the target web page, because a web page includes an HTML, which is the web page content, but it also includes what Citoid, which is the automatic citation generator of Wikipedia would generate for this target web page. And it also includes the HTTP headers that the web server would send to request the web page. And it also includes the URL of the web page. So when we give a target web page to the procedure, some items from this web page are selected following these selection steps. This provides a selection output that is given to the series of transformations that transform these items selected to finally give a procedure output, like the one we saw before. So let me go back to the presentation. Yeah, okay. I hope that this doesn't happen again. Okay, so Going back to the overview, we said that we had configuration split into domains. Each domain has multiple templates. Now, if we want to further subdivide translation, we have what we call URL path patterns. A URL path pattern is a pattern that a URL should follow, in which case we are going to assign it to a specific translation subgroup. So for example, here we define /blog/wildcard pattern. So any URL that looks like this is going to be assigned to this URL path pattern. And we always have in every domain a catch-all pattern in case we have not defined patterns or in case a given URL does not match any pattern previously defined. So, and to end with the overview, let's go back to our summary. This is like the complete, everything we've seen so far. So if we give Web2Cit a target web page, let's say in this example, what we're given example.com/blog/article2, which is written here. So the first thing Web2Cit does is it checks what domain this target page belongs to. So in this case, it's not going to use the configuration defined for subexample.com because that's not the domain we are targeting. It is going to use the configuration defined for example.com. Once we have established what domain the target web page belongs to, we have to establish what URL path pattern it belongs to. So because it is example.com/blog, it belongs to this pattern here above. So we're not going to use the templates that belong to the fallback pattern, just the templates that belong to this /blog/wildcard pattern. And at this point, Web2Cit is going to try sequentially every template defined for this pattern. It's going to try this one first and this one next, until it finds a template that applies for the target web page given. The moment it finds one, it will return a citation. In case it doesn't find anyone, then we're going to use a fallback template. All patterns include a fallback template that always applies, and for the moment, it just returns what cited would have returned. But this is not, that's not so important right now. So that's like the overview. I know that this was quite fast. Do you have some questions about this up to here? I was told once that actually the right way to ask this question, whether someone has a question, is to ask anyone to ask a question, in fact. But we didn't have that much time right now, so let's move forward because I'm not sure I can fit everything in 1 hour. I will try. Let's move forward and maybe force some questions later on with the architecture. So regarding the Web2Cit software ecosystem, the core part of the ecosystem is the core library. Everything we've just seen is implemented in the core library. And the core library is consumed by other parts of the Web2Cit ecosystem. It is consumed, it depends on, it is used by the translation server. The translation server is a web service, which we give it a target web page, and the service returns a translation using the translation rules that have been collaboratively defined by the community. It is also used by the translation editor, which is the piece of software that is not implemented yet and which we will use to edit these translation configurations in a visual manner. And it is also used by the translation monitor, which is also to be implemented and which is the part of the ecosystem that is constantly checking a part that we have not seen here, which are the translation tests, so that it's regularly checking that those tests are passing, because if they're not, it means that we're having a problem and that we have to go and solve it. And because the translation editor is meant to be running on a web browser, probably most of the code is going to be running client side, then we needed the translation editor. Actually, we decided the translation editor to be in JavaScript. And because the translation editor was going to be consuming the core library, then we decided that the core library should be written in JavaScript as well. Specifically, we decided to use TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript that is optionally statically typed. This means that it's a little bit more complex than JavaScript, but in my opinion, it provides several advantages because one has to type each variable when declaring it, and one has to define what each function would return, what type each function would return, and the type of the arguments that you are given to the function. Then the code usually becomes cleaner in the end, and you catch more bugs while writing the code, among other advantages. I mean, it implies a little bit more of learning if you're not familiar with TypeScript, but it's not that much, and I think that the benefits outweigh the time that you need to learn it. Now to the architecture. To show the core library architecture, I'm going to be going through a UML diagram that I have just prepared. This diagram is available in the resources that I shared at the beginning. The link is also here. I'm going to share this with you because I think that if while I'm explaining something, you find that you would like to review something that we saw before, maybe it's worth it that you can go back. So just let me copy this in the chat. It should be like this here. And there you will find the .dia file, which you have to have a special software to open it, but you have it's been exported to PDF. And UML means Unified Modeling Language. I'm a very beginner with this. I've just learned the very basics to show this diagram, and I'm going to show these basics very quickly in the next slide. So in UML, you can do lots of things. I'm just a beginner, so please forgive me. I will probably make some mistakes while explaining this. If someone wants to correct them, you feel more than welcome. So in UML, you can represent, for example, a software class. This would be a software class. And classes have members, you have properties, and you also have methods or operations. So these here above are the properties. Well, I'm not going to go into detail, but these properties can be public properties, which mean anyone from outside the class can check what that property's value is or also change it. It can be a static member, a static property, which means that because, you have a class, and for those of you who know a little bit about object-oriented programming, you have a class and you can derive a specific instance of that class, a specific object. A static property that does not belong to a specific instance, but to the class itself. You can also have private properties, which can be used within the class, the object of that class, but that cannot be used from objects outside that don't belong to that class. And beside properties, you also have methods. And methods take parameters. Those parameters can be of different types. When I mean type, I mean it might be a string, it might be an integer, it might be a specific of a specific shape. And these methods have a return type, which is what is the type of the value that this function, that this method would return. And classes can be independent classes, but they can also be derived from parent classes through by inheritance. I mean, so this class would derive from this parent class, and in doing so, it would inherit some of its properties of its methods. And also some methods can be abstract methods, which mean that we are not implementing the method in the class, we are defining them, we are implementing them on the class that is derived from them. And I'm actually basing my the way I'm explaining this by Guadalupe saying yes. Like I'm not seeing like other faces, so I assume that everything is more or less following me. Then we will also see in these diagrams some data types. Like we said that a type could be a string, an integer, or an object of a specific shape. This way, we're going to define what's the shape of those objects. And finally, and very hastily again, because maybe not everyone is familiar with this, with JavaScript. In JavaScript, we have a way of dealing with asynchronous code, which is by returning something that is called promises. So usually, if you're running a code, you would go from top to bottom. You run this function, you run this function, then this function, and only when the previous function has ended, we continue with the next line. But that sometimes is inconvenient because some function might take long to run. So we want to continue running the code, and only when the function has ended, we kind of create a fork there, and we will have a callback function that is going to be run when that function finishes. In JavaScript, asynchronous functions return promises, and these promises are resolved with a value. Like say, I am an asynchronous function. I return a promise which has not finished, which doesn't have a return value yet, but when the function finishes running, the promise resolves to the returned value. Yeah, and we can attach to those promises callback functions. But anyway, if I show in this diagram that a function is returning a promise, it means that it's running asynchronously, okay, and that the return value is going to be handled by a callback function that is going to be executed when the promise has resolved. Are the basics, like some basics, and now some disclaimers before starting with the actual presentation. These diagrams are not 100% accurate, the ones I'm going to show. This is because, let's give just an example. We might have a property that is actually private, that is set via a setter, and we do that because we want some logic before letting the user set the variable value. Let's say that a value, if a property's value needs a specific validation. If we let the user set that value freely, then the user would be able to set that to potentially anything. So we want to validate the input. So in that case, we set the variable not directly, but through a setter, because that would imply providing much more complex UML diagrams. I have not included things like that. I've just included like more of a surface overview. If you want to know the details, we might have a more detailed diagram in the future, maybe, probably not in the short term, or you can check the code. The diagrams also may not be complete. Some elements of the diagram may have been ignored, again, because for the sake of simplicity. For example, some private methods, some private properties. And please bear in mind that even though I've been working as a programmer for some time already, I'm quite new to formal software design. I have some software design intuitions because of my experience, but I have no formal knowledge yet. This is something that I want to learn, like, for example, design patterns, design principles. So again, please forgive me if I'm not talking about these things in this presentation, and forgive me or correct me if I'm making some mistakes. And having said that, we can get started. Please let me know, do you have any questions about this up to here? All right. So we will start with some kind of a parenthesis here. We will start with...
Yeah. Did you clarify what is the meaning of UML?
Yeah, thanks. We will start with some kind of a parenthesis, which is our web page. Our web page is objects. This web page can either be a target web page that we want to translate. It can be a template web page we're basing our translation templates on. And this web pages, which is as shown here, is defined by a domain name, by a specific path, And it also includes a couple of cache objects. And it includes these cache objects because it might be that we need to download some things related to this web page, like the HTML or the cited response. And we don't want to download those stuff multiple times. So we keep a cache. So this cache can be an HTTP cache. In this case, the HTTP cache would have a URL indicating what URL that HTTP cache belongs to. And it has a method to get the cache data. When we run this method, we request the web server for this URL to retrieve some data to fill this cache with. Specifically, that data, as we see here, this method is returning a promise, which will later on resolve to a HTTP cache data object. And this object includes a body, which is the HTML of the web page. It includes a document. The document is the representation of that HTML as a DOM tree. And that representation is created using a JavaScript library that emulates being a browser, which is called JS DOM. And the reason we can get into why I'm doing this, there are some advantages of working with a parsed DOM tree rather than working on the HTML alone. Like, for example, if we want to run XPath queries, we need the DOM tree. That's why we are deriving the DOM tree from the HTML body. And it also includes a headers object, which is a map of header name to header content for the server HTTP response headers. Another type of response cache is the cytoid cache. And the cytoid cache also has a URL as a property. It also has a get data operation or method. But in this case, instead of the promise that it returns, instead of resolving to an HTTP cache data object, it resolves to a cytoid cache data object, which includes a citation, which is a series of field names and field values, like item type, website, title, whatever, title, authors, list of authors. This is a parenthesis I'm doing now regarding web page, because what I'm going to show now, the web page object is repeatedly used in what I'm going to show now. And that's why I wanted to make this parenthesis at the beginning. And now I'm going to start describing the hierarchy of objects inside the core. So I'm going to start from the very basic small elements up to the more complex elements that are nesting these smaller elements inside. So remember from my previous explanation that we had templates. These templates had fields. The fields had procedures, and each procedure was a series of selection steps and transformation steps. So we're gonna group those selection and transformation steps into a translation step. This is like our parent class. Specifically, then we have selection step class. And the selection step class has a type, because we have different kinds of selections. We can select items using XPath. We can select items using cycloid selection. So here it says what type of selection step a specific instance is. The configuration value says specifically how the selection step should behave. For example, if it is an XPath selection step, the configuration would be what is the XPath expression to select a specific HTML node. Or if it is a cytoid selection, then the configuration would be which specific cytoid field we should be selecting. It configures the behavior of the selection step. And it has an apply method, which is an alias of the select method. And if we give the select method a target web page, then the selection step is going to apply on the target web page given, and it's going to return a selection. And this selection is an array of strings selected. Like we have a web page, we apply a selection step, and the output of the selection step is a list of strings that were selected from the web page using this selection step. This is what I call a step output. The step output, where you see it, is as an array of strings. I'm going to skip some parts because otherwise we won't make it. This is just an example of a specific cited selection step class. It inherits from the general selection class, and it has some particularities, like, for example, not every configuration value is accepted as cited selection. And the specific implementation of the select method changes depending on whether this is a cited selection or an expert selection. This is just a possible cited selection type. We have others. We have the fixed selection, the expert selection, but this is not what this talk is about. On the other hand, we have our transformation steps. Remember, transformation step, what it does is it gets a selection output and it transforms it. In the end, we have a value that is valid for the specific field that the procedure belongs to. And in this case, we also have a type that says what specific transformation step this is. It also has a configuration value that defines how the transformation step should behave. It has an item-wise property, which I'm not going to get into. We didn't get into it in the early adopter guidelines video either. Just read the documentation if you're interested. And it has a transform method that takes a step output, like the output, for example, of a selection, or the output of another transformation step. It gets that as an input, and it outputs a new step output, now transformed. And you might be wondering why we are returning promises. Why aren't we not doing this immediately? Why do we have to wait until the function ends and only then call the callback function? And the reason is that we are passing these methods a web page object that we have just seen. And as you have seen, that web page object has some cache objects inside. We may not always need, for example, the HTTP cache for a web page, or we may not always need the Citoid cache for a web page. So we will only request the HTML of a web page if there is a selection step that needs the HTML. We will not request the Citoid response for a web page if there is not a Citoid selection step that is requesting it. So it is a promise, because if we have, for example, let's say we have a Citoid selection, we check the web page. If we don't have a cache for the Citoid yet, then we go and get it. And that's why we need a promise, because that might take some time. But the outcome of this is we are trying to reduce as much as possible how much time it takes to apply a procedure, because we're not gonna request for example, Citoid response if we're not gonna need it. And also because the web page object is reused by all selection steps of all fields, of all procedures, of all templates. If we get the HTML once to be used by one specific selection, then we won't need it to get it twice, because we already have it in our cache for other selection steps in the same template or another template. Let's go up in the hierarchy. So we go to a translation procedure. Remember that we had fields. Inside these fields, we had procedures. And as you see here, inside the procedure, we have a selections property, which is an array of selection objects, as we have just seen them, and a transformation property, which is an array of transformation objects. And the translation procedure has a translate method that if you give it a web page, it is going to return a procedure output. And the most important property of this procedure output is a step output, which is actually the result of having applied the selection steps and then the series of transformation steps. Then you get a procedure output. Mainly what the translate method translation procedure does is it calls the select method of all selection steps. It does that in parallel because the order how we apply them doesn't change the result. And then it calls the transform method of the series of transformation objects in sequence. First the first one, then the second one, and the output of the last one, that is the procedure output. Let's go a little bit upwards. We have translation procedure. Now we have template field. remember that the procedures were not loose in the template. They were grouped into template fields. You could have one or more procedure within each template field. The template field class is derived from the translation field class because we will also use this. We will also use fields in the test configuration, which we have not explained because it's not implemented yet. But the template field has a name property which tell us what is the name of the field. It can be item type, author last, title, and so on. It has a couple properties regarding validation. So is the value for this field an array or not? For example, if it is a title, it should not be an array. We only have one title for a source. But if it is the author last property, the author last field name, then it might be an array because we might have multiple last names as the author. And it also includes a pattern. And this pattern is a regular expression that defines the validation for this specific template. Sorry, let's go again. Let's say this is item type. The pattern of the item type field is gonna say what the value should look like to be considered a valid value as an item or not. Remember when we said that how we decided if a template applied for a specific web page or not, and we said that it applied if for all required fields the output was a valid output. How do we calculate whether an output is valid or not? Well, we use this regular expression defined here in the pattern property. And thank you, Wada. Yes, sure, I can give an example. Was the example the one I just gave okay? Or shall I give another one? I can give another one. Yeah, sure. So let's say, for example, that we have item type, the item type field. In that case, name will be item type. Is array will be false because item type just supports one value. It is either a website or it is a newspaper article. It cannot be both. And pattern, in this case, would be because we support a specific set of item types like website, newspaper article. The regular expression would be either website, either newspaper article, either journal article, and so on. If it was, for example, the field date, again, name would be date, is array would be false because we can just have one date, and pattern would be number, dash, number, dash, number, which means year, month, date, okay? If it was, for example, an author last name, then anything that is not an empty string, okay? Then we have a procedures property, which is an array of procedure objects. And finally, a required property that is telling us whether this is a required field or not. And this is necessary to decide if the template that this field belongs to is applicable or not. And again, we also have a translate method that if we give it a web page, it's gonna call the translate method of every procedure inside the procedures object to output a template field output. And the template field output includes an output property, which is just an array of strings. And this is, of course, the result of the selection step plus the transformation steps, the multiple procedure outputs combined. That's going to give the field output. And it also has a property that says if this output is valid for this specific field. Okay, I continue. I'm reaching the top of the hierarchy. Next, we have the translation template. The translation template, I'm gonna refer to this one down here. It refers to a specific web page. Remember, we write a translation template based on a specific template web page. This is the template web page that we refer to in this template property. This is not the target web page that we're gonna give to the translate method. This is the template web page we're basing our template on. We currently don't have any use for this, but we will in the future because some selection steps will depend on the translation template, but it's not something implemented yet. It has a label, which is a fancy name for that template. And it has a fields object, which is simply an array of template fields, which is the object that we saw just in the previous slide. And again, it also has a translate method, but if you give it a target web page, it's going to return, in this case, a template output. And the template output includes an outputs property that is a series of template field outputs, one for each field. It will tell you if it is applicable. Of course, if all template field outputs are applicable, then the overall template that contains them all will be applicable as well. Otherwise, it's not going to be applicable. And we have a special kind of template, which is the fallback template that I explained in the overview at the beginning, which does not have any template. That's why any web page template. That's why it's undefined. Remember that the fallback template is the one we used if no regular template applied for the given target web page. And finally, not yet, but relatively there, we have translation templates on the one hand, and we also have URL path patterns on the other hand. The URL path pattern hierarchy is way simpler, sorry. And we only have one class here, is the path pattern class, label to give it a fancy name. It has a pattern. This is the configuration of the path pattern object. Here it says what the URL path pattern looks like for example, in our example, /blog/wildcard. And it also has a regex, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it in English, regex property, which is a regular expression derived from this string pattern. And for this, we use a JavaScript library that's called Minimatch that gives glob support for JavaScript, but doesn't matter. And path pattern objects have a match method. Remember, the translation template object had translate method. The path pattern object has a match method. And if we give it a path, it will tell us if this URL path pattern matches that path or not. Like if we give it, if the pattern was /blog/wildcard and we /blog/article, it's going to tell us, yes, true, this matches. If we gave it /news/something, it's going to tell us false, this doesn't match. How do we aggregate this into a configuration? And this is where we will see our configuration objects. We will start with the abstract domain configuration from which specific configuration sets are derived. I mean, template configuration, pattern configuration, and test configuration. I'm not going to go much into detail here because we don't have much time, but very briefly, we have a domain. So it tells us what domain this configuration object is for. It gives us some information regarding how we should get this from our repository in Meta, which is Wikimedia project. For those of you who might not be that familiar, doesn't matter. Very briefly, I'm not going to go into detail. Bear in mind, we have a storage of revisions because those configurations that are saved in Meta might have multiple versions because collaboratively we will be editing them, and Web2Cit core library is ready to work with any of them. Say we want to see how translation looked like 3 months ago before some vandalism occurred. We can go fetch the previous configuration and try the translation with that previous configuration. That's what revisions are for, but I'm not going to go into detail because we don't have time. And specifically, we have the values property that stores the specific configurations. So for example, if this was a template configuration object, the values would store the different templates for that specific configuration. If it was a patterns configuration, then it would store the specific path pattern objects. We'll see the example now. And that's it. I'm not going to go into detail here because, again, we won't have time otherwise. So the specific template configuration class, we have 2 things to highlight here. First of all, it has the templates property, which is just an alias of the values property. And here we store, let's say, for example, we have 5 templates defined for example.com. Then templates property would have template object 1, template object 2, 1 until template object 5. We have the special fallback property, which stores the fallback template. And we have a translate with method that we give it a target web page. We tell which specific templates we want to use to translate that web page. Say, for example, we give Web2Cit a web page. We see what URL path pattern it belongs to. So now we have a smaller subset of templates that also belong to that URL path pattern. So to the translate with method, we tell it, translate this web page, but only use these 3 templates, because those are the only 3 templates that belong to the same URL path pattern. And the method will return a template output. And then we also have a pattern configuration that has two important properties. Bear with me, I know this might be a little bit complicated. In the last slide, we're going to see this in action. It has a catch all property that includes the path pattern that catches it all in case we have not defined a specific URL path pattern, or a given target web page does not match any pattern in particular. And it has a sort paths method that what it does is I give it a one path or a series of paths, and it tells and it sorts them into the different URL patterns in the configuration. So let's give an example. Let's say in this patterns property, we have 3 patterns, and we give the sort paths a series of paths. It's going to tell us, okay, for first pattern, these are the URL paths that sort into it. For this other pattern, these are the paths that sort into it, and so on. I'm sorry, I know this might be the most complicated slide of them all, and the topmost element in the hierarchy is the domain class. The domain has the domain name. It includes a template configuration object. It includes a pattern configuration object, a test configuration object, which we have not seen. And it has one method. It has other methods as well, but it has one method, which is like the topmost translate method. Give this translate method a web page. Give some options that we're not going to see now. And here it will run the translate with method of the template configuration. It will run the sort path method of the pattern configuration. It will run all the translate methods nested in all the select method of the selection steps, all the transformation methods of the transformation step. And in the end, it's going to output a final translation output. That was a lot of information, wasn't it? So finally, this should have been done with UML as well. Unfortunately, I do not. Yes, quite intense. Yes, I'm sorry, Nidia. I'm sorry, everyone. I haven't practiced this yet. Probably this should have been a 1 hour and a half conversation rather than just an hour. I apologize. Just to been written with UML as well, but I didn't know how to use UML to write dynamics. So instead, I've just written this with bullets. So let's see how to use all of this. How, for example, the translation server uses the core library. It first instantiates a domain object. It gives it a name. So for example, instantiate a domain object for example.com. Then inside this domain object, we have multiple configuration objects. We have a template configuration, a pattern configuration, and a test configuration. So for each of these configuration objects, we didn't see this, but each of these configuration objects have a method to fetch the configuration from our repository in Meta. So for the template configuration, the fetch method is run, and we get the configuration from Meta. The same for the pattern configuration. This content fetched from Meta is parsed, because actually in Meta we can store anything. So we parse it to make sure that the configuration file is okay, it's not corrupted. And we load the configuration. Like, for example, if in Meta we have that for example.com, we had 5 templates, we load those 5 templates into the template configuration object. The same the pattern configuration object. Oh, this shouldn't have appeared here as a block. Sorry. Let's focus on step 3 here. So we go to the domain object that we instantiated in step 1, and we run the overall general translate method. We give it a web page, a target web page that we want to translate, and we run the translate method. What does this method does? Well, first thing, this bullet 1 here, it gets the pattern configuration object, and it runs the sort path method of the target of the pattern configuration object. This way, we know for this target web page what URL path pattern it belongs to. And the moment we know that, we know what templates belong to that path pattern as well. So those are the things we're going to try one by one, not the others. If you remember from the first slides, we have a target web page. We first see what domain it belongs to, and then we see what URL path pattern it belongs to. This is done by the sort path method of the pattern configuration object, which in turn uses the match method of the path pattern objects that we saw. And then once we know what we have to try, we use the template configuration translate with method. We give it the web page object, we give it the translate method paths that we are going to try, and it's going to use the nested translate method of the translate method of the nested objects, like the translate method of the template objects, then translate method of the field object, the translate method of the procedure objects, the select method of the selection step objects, the transform method of the transformation step objects, and then it's going to create a translation output as we saw in the previous slide. How the method node, which are the candidate templates from Meta. From Meta, this is a question by Guadalupe. From Meta, you're getting all the templates, yeah? And also you're getting all the URL path patterns. So the pattern configuration object, what it does is you give it a but let me explain it anyway, because maybe your question is somebody else's question. So let's say my target, let's go to I think this is gonna be useful. This slide here, this is gonna be useful. So we have example.com/blog/article2. We create the domain object given example.com to the domain creator. So that moment we have this domain object created. And now we give to the pattern configuration object this URL, and the pattern configuration object sort path method is going to return, okay, for this URL, you have to use pattern /blocks/wildcard. And we use that method again. I haven't explained in detail, but we use that method so that we tell it, okay, now tell me which templates also match that pattern. And the sort path method is going to say, okay, I have /blog/article1, and I have /blog/post1. And then we're going to give that to the translate with method of the template configuration. And that method is going to try template for blog article1 for this target web page. Does it return is this applicable? No. Okay, so continue next one. Try this one. Is that applicable? Yes. Okay, so return a citation. Okay, I see we are almost at the time this should have ended. Again, I sincerely apologize that this took longer than expected. I have extra time, but please feel free to ask questions now, or we can continue the conversation on the Web2Cit advisory board as well, mailing list. But please feel free now to ask any questions you may have.
Yeah, I don't actually have any questions. I think I just need a little time to digest this. But yeah, this was, I know I'd said, like, I generally prefer written documentation, but this this was really, really helpful. So thanks, Diego, like going through it with the UML there as well.
Sorry, what did you say at the end, Peter?
It was really helpful, you walking
Okay.
through it with, I had the UML diagram open as well,
Okay.
walking through it.
Well, also, like as I said at the first slide, I definitely recognize that written documentation is easier to follow. I definitely recognize that. I also was thinking of this as a fast overview. I know it's complex. It's not something that you can pay attention to while driving your car or driving your bicycle, for sure not. But I thought of it as a general sometimes it happens to me that I land in a project and that I want to have a general overview, like very fast without having to delve into the details. So I thought this as a solution for that, because that this general architecture of the core library is not going to change in the future, not at least in the short-term future. This is going to stay relatively stable, even if we make changes like to the details in the future. So I think this is going to continue being valid or generally valid for quite some time. Okay, so if nobody has any further questions or comments, we can finish this so that we respect the hour we said this was gonna last. But we're gonna upload this to YouTube and to Commons as well, and we can continue our discussion on the advisory board mailing list, or also you can write to me directly.
Diego, if you prefer,
Yes.
you can continue with the presentation in order to like have the whole video or something. I mean, I don't know.
I can do it. I'm not sure if anyone has to leave, please do so. And I'm not sure if Evelyn can stay. And she's the host.
I can stay for another 30 minutes.
Okay, so having said this, if anyone has to leave, please feel free to do so now. And if anyone has any further questions or comments, I'm more than happy to discuss them now.
The information in the meta is like, it's there. You don't like create it, right?
You mean the configuration files?
Yeah, like for example, here in this, I don't know, in the screen, you have domain, pattern block, template, etc., where it came from.
That's a great question. That's the translation configuration that Web2Cit users will define collaboratively and continuously. That's why we have several revisions, for example. That's something that I couldn't explain in detail when I was explaining the domain configuration class. Now, the only way I'm going to show this because even though this could be clear for someone who has been working with Web2Cit already, one of our early adopters, it might not be clear for those watching this video or attending this meeting right now. So this is, for example, the templates JSON configuration file for the www.usatoday.com domain. And here you have the definition in this, the way how this file is structured is available in our early adopters guideline. So in this case, it is a series of an array of template definitions, which, for example, from here to here, we have one template definition. And template definitions have a path, and they also have a fields property, which is a series of template field object definitions. Have procedures inside, which is a series of procedure object definitions. So what the structure, the type of elements that we've seen in the architecture, they are more or less reflected in these configuration files. Right now, the only way we have to edit these configuration files is manually. You can follow the information in the early adopters guideline. So because you can also use like some validation tools, and you also can see there what field names are supported and how to use the different selection steps supported and so on. But in the future, we're currently entering the second phase of the Web2Cit project. We're now gonna start developing a visual editor so that these configuration files can be edited visually, because editing this manually is definitely not a simple thing. It is, I think, much easier than what we had so far, where if we wanted to tweak translation, we had to go and write a Zotero Cytoid translator, which was written in JavaScript. It was very powerful, but you had to know JavaScript. To do this, you have to read the early adopters guideline, and maybe you have to know a little bit about JSON, but or not a little bit, maybe quite a lot. But you can tweak configuration without knowing how to program. And one thing, this is not a question, but it's a comment that I think it's worth making. Back to the selection, the translation steps. The way how this has been created is very standard. I mean, each selection step has a type parameter, has a config parameter, and it looks exactly like a transformation step, only that transformation steps also have an item-wise, not parameter property, sorry. And both steps can be called with an apply method. The apply method of the selection step calls the select method of that step, and the apply method of the transformation step calls the transform method. And why am I highlighting this? Because that makes it very modular, so that right now we only have cytoid, XPath, and fixed selection steps. If we want to support in the future a fourth selection step, for example, the URL selection step that we plan to support, we only have to create a class that implements a specific implementation, sorry for the redundancy, of the select method that explains how the URL selection should work. And as long as it returns a step output, which is the apply method should always return, you have a new selection step type working in Web2Cit. So these are the selection and the transformation steps are the core pieces of Web2Cit in a way. And they are very extensible, because if at any point we decide that we need another selection step or another transformation step that we had not thought of before, it is really and relatively quite simple to implement them. Of course, you have to go back to I mean, you need a programmer to do that. We have to update the code. We have to update the core library. But it's relatively simple to do it, because it's been thought in this modular way. Well, I don't. If we don't have any more questions, that's fine. And again, we can continue discussing this through any of the channels that we have available. And I thank you all very much again for being here today. This was really helpful, also for me, because again, like having to think this, well, makes you understand things better. And also I have identified some things that we could change, because this UML is what it reflects 90% of what we already have, but in some cases there were some deviations, and I was like, we should have done this way. So the UML shows how we should have done it, and now I have to change the code. But it's like very small changes. This is the overall structure, the overall architecture of the library. And thank you again very much for being here.